Yeah, I think it could be a lot worse.
You got kind of a raw deal when your dad passed away.
Imagine growing up in a house with 123 rooms, a bowling alley 2 floors beneath your bedroom, and a guest list that once included a real prince and princess. Now imagine that same childhood ending with your father's $600 million fortune landing almost entirely in your mother's hands, while you were handed a check for $800,000 and told, quite literally, that it should be enough to last you the rest of your life. That is not a plot twist from one of Tori Spelling's own primetime dramas. That is the actual inheritance story of his daughter, Tori Spelling. And 2 decades later, people are still arguing about how it happened, whether it was fair, and why nobody in that family ever took it to court. To understand why this inheritance still sparks outrage today, you have to start with the man who built the fortune in the first place. Tori Spelling was not just a television producer. For a stretch of the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, he was arguably the single most powerful storyteller in American pop culture. Charlie's Angels, The Love Boat Dynasty, Beverly Hills 90210, Melrose Place, and Charmed all carried his name as executive producer. And at his peak, he had so many shows running simultaneously on one network that industry insiders half-jokingly claimed the network's initials secretly stood for his own name. He did not just make television shows. He shaped what an entire generation wore, talked about, and expected from prime time. That kind of success bought a kind of home most people only see in movies. In the mid-1980s, Aaron and his wife Candy tore down an old Bing Crosby estate in the Holmby Hills neighborhood of Los Angeles and spent years building what became known simply as the Manor. When it was finished in 1988, it clocked in at more than 56,000 square feet, larger than the White House, spread across dozens of rooms that included a bowling alley, multiple bars, a screening room, a doll museum, and enough parking underground for 100 cars. It was, by every measure, one of the largest privately owned homes in Los Angeles County, and it was the house Tori Spelling grew up calling home. Fame was simply the air she breathed. She was born in May 1973, already the daughter of a man reshaping American television, and by the time she was a teenager, actual royalty had slept under her family's roof. Prince Charles and Princess Diana stayed at the manor in the 1990s, and the guest suite they used was informally renamed after them from that point on. Tori did her homework in a house where a kitchen could be scaled up to cater 800 people for a party, and where the line between ordinary family life and Hollywood spectacle simply did not exist. The manor was not just large. It was engineered for a lifestyle that most people only encounter in fiction. There were reportedly hidden passageways behind bookshelves and wall panels that led to secret rooms, an entire underground level with a two-lane bowling alley, and its own dedicated shoe closet, 3 separate bars, an arcade, and a private museum housing detailed dolls modeled after Aaron's own children. Growing up inside a house like that meant birthdays, holidays, and ordinary weekday afternoons all carried a kind of scale that made the outside world feel small by comparison. It is worth remembering that context whenever people question why Tori's later financial struggles felt so jarring to outside observers. Her entire baseline for what normal looked like had been set impossibly high before she ever earned a paycheck of her own. Given that upbringing, it is not surprising that Tori ended up in front of the camera herself. Her father put her in an acting class at age 6, and small roles followed through her childhood and teenage years. But everything changed in 1990. When Aaron cast her as Donna Martin on a new Fox drama called Beverly Hills 90210. She stayed with that role for the entire 10-season run, becoming one of the most recognizable young actresses on American television. The show turned into a genuine phenomenon, eventually pulling in more than 20 million viewers an episode at its peak, and airing in over 20 countries. That success, though, came with an asterisk that followed Tori for years. Long before the cameras rolled, she tried auditioning for other parts on the show under a fake name, hoping to prove she could get cast without her father's influence. It did not work. Casting directors already knew exactly who she was, and Aaron himself joked openly about the situation around town, which only fueled the perception that the role had been handed to her rather than earned. Aaron's attempt to counter that criticism was almost strange in its own right. He insisted his daughter be paid only union-scale minimum wage for the job, even as the show became a runaway hit and her castmates negotiated far higher salaries. It did little to quiet the skeptics, but Tori stayed the course, ultimately appearing in nearly every single episode across all 10 seasons and slowly earning a reputation as a genuinely durable, hard-working member of the cast. Outside of Donna Martin, Tori built a surprisingly varied resume through the 1990s. She played a fictionalized version of herself inside the movie within a movie in Scream 2, starred in the Sundance premiere indie film The House of Yes, and headlined the campy television thriller Mother, May I Sleep with Danger? A movie so beloved by cult audiences that it was remade 2 decades later, with Tori returning in a different role. By the time 90,210 wrapped in 2000, she had built a career that stretched well beyond being the producer's daughter. Even if that label never fully disappeared from the public conversation, awards recognition came alongside the criticism, too, which is a detail often left out of the nepotism baby narrative that followed her for years. In the early 1990s, she picked up industry recognition for guest work completely separate from her father's productions, and by the mid-1990s, she was carrying television movies almost entirely on her own name recognition, well outside the built-in safety net of a Spelling-produced series. It is a more complicated picture than the tabloids of the era generally allowed for. A young actress who undeniably benefited from her father's influence at the start, but who also kept working steadily enough and diversely enough to build a career that outlasted the initial round of skepticism. Her personal life, meanwhile, was about to become just as public as her career. In the summer of 2004, at 31 years old, Tori married actor and playwright Charlie Shanian in an elaborate wedding held on her father's estate, reportedly costing around $1 million. It looked, on the surface, like the fairy tale ending to a childhood spent surrounded by extravagance. It lasted barely more than a year. While filming a television movie in Canada in the summer of 2005, Tori met actor Dean McDermott, and the two began an affair that same night, even though both of them were married to other people at the time. Dean had been married to Mary Jo Eustace for 13 years, and the couple had just adopted an infant daughter only days before Dean and Tori met. The fallout was swift and brutal in the tabloids, with Tori publicly cast as the woman who broke up 2 marriages at once. Both divorces were finalized within months of each other, and Tori and Dean married in a private ceremony in Fiji in the spring of 2006. It was only weeks after that wedding that the story takes its most consequential turn. On June 23, 2006, Tori Spelling died at the manor at the age of 83, just days after suffering a severe stroke. He had also been battling health problems for years, including an earlier diagnosis of oral cancer, and when his death certificate was filed, Alzheimer's disease was listed as a contributing cause. That single detail would go on to shadow everything that came next, because estate lawyers and outside observers eventually learned that Aaron had revised his will only about 2 months before he passed away, at a point when his cognitive health was already documented as compromised. The revision was not a minor tweak. Under the new terms, Tori and her younger brother Randy each stood to inherit roughly $800,000 out of an estate valued somewhere between $500 million and $600 million. To put that in perspective, that amount represented a small fraction of 1% of their father's total fortune. Nearly everything else, an estimated $500 million or more, went to their mother, Candy Spelling, who was also named sole trustee of the family trust, giving her complete control over how the rest of the assets were managed and distributed going forward. What makes this story more than just an unusual family arrangement is the legal mechanism baked into the will itself, a no-contest clause. Under that clause, if either sibling formally challenged the will and lost, they would forfeit whatever inheritance they had already been promised, meaning Tori's choice essentially came down to accepting $800,000 quietly or risking walking away with absolutely nothing. Given that her father's cognitive decline was already a matter of public medical record by the time the will was rewritten, many legal observers have pointed out that this would have been exactly the kind of situation where a challenge might have had real merit. And yet, neither Tori nor Randy ever filed one. The no-contest clause did precisely what it was designed to do. There is also a detail in the estate paperwork itself that tends to sting almost as much as the headline numbers. According to later reporting on the will, several longtime household employees, people like the family's interior decorator and Candy's personal manicurist, received specific cash gifts in the tens of thousands of dollars. None of those figures came close to matching what Tori or Randy received, but the fact that staff members were named individually at all, while the two adult children were given a flat, comparatively modest sum, only reinforced how deliberate the final version of the will appears to have been. It was not an oversight. It was a document that spelled out, almost line by line, exactly how the family's wealth was meant to flow after Aaron was gone. Perhaps the most quietly devastating detail in the entire story is something Tori has spoken about publicly in the years since, before he passed away. Her father reportedly told her that $800,000 should be enough to set her up for life. She later reflected that he simply no longer understood the real value of money by that point. A chilling observation from a man who had spent decades building one of the largest fortunes in television history. For a woman raised with a private household staff, closets the size of apartments, and vacations most people can only dream about, $800,000 was never going to stretch as far as her father seemed to believe it would. The years that followed proved exactly how right that concern was. Tori and Dean poured much of that inheritance into a bed-and-breakfast property in rural California, which became the centerpiece of their first reality show together. Neighbors later claimed the couple was rarely there outside of filming days, and the business never became the sustainable venture they had hoped for. From there, the spending only grew more difficult to track. By her own admission in later interviews and in her memoirs, Tori acknowledged she had never really learned how to manage money on her own, since business managers had handled her finances since she was a teenager working on 90210. Failed real estate deals, a shuttered retail business, extravagant shopping habits, and constant reality television production costs steadily ate away at whatever financial cushion remained. By the early 2010s, the cracks were impossible to hide. Tori publicly admitted she was deep in debt after her reality series was canceled and a steady paycheck disappeared. Lawsuits followed from credit card companies and banks over unpaid balances. Tax liens began piling up with state and federal authorities. By the early 2020s, the couple's combined tax debt alone had climbed into the millions of dollars, a staggering figure for two people who had once been treated as Hollywood royalty by association. Then, in 2013, the marriage itself began to collapse publicly when reports surfaced that Dean had been unfaithful while filming a television project in Canada. The story became a media sensation, complete with graphic interviews from the other woman involved that ran in tabloids just before the holidays. Dean checked himself into a treatment facility soon afterward, and rather than handling the fallout privately, Tori made the decision to launch a new reality series documenting the crisis in real time, including actual therapy sessions. Critics accused the couple of manufacturing the entire scandal to fuel a television deal, though outside reporting at the time suggested the affair and the marital breakdown were genuine, however messy the public handling of it became. What is easy to forget amid the tabloid noise of that period is how much strain the family was already carrying behind the scenes. Tori has said in later interviews that she genuinely cared for her first husband and never wanted to hurt him, even as she pursued a new relationship in a way she later described as one of her deepest regrets. That kind of candor became something of a pattern for her over the years, a willingness to publicly own her mistakes even when it invited more criticism rather than less. It is part of why so many people who otherwise disapprove of how she has handled her finances still tend to feel a certain amount of sympathy toward her personally. The marriage limped forward for nearly another decade, but the underlying financial instability never really went away. Then, in 2023, an entirely new crisis emerged. After years of unexplained illness among her 5 children, ranging from persistent rashes to fevers and respiratory infections that never seemed to fully clear, a professional inspection revealed the rental home the family was living in was contaminated with toxic mold and effectively uninhabitable. Tori went public about the diagnosis, explaining that doctors had spent years unable to explain why her children kept getting sick, when the real culprit had been sitting inside their own walls the entire time. Leaving that house, however, meant facing a housing crisis of a kind almost nobody expected from someone with a Spelling name. By the summer of 2023, Tori and her 5 children were photographed staying in a modest motel, and shortly after that, living out of an RV at a campground. It was an image that seemed almost impossible to reconcile with her childhood at the manor, and it spread across entertainment news outlets as a symbol of just how far the family's finances had fallen. Around the same time, Tori and Dean formally separated, with Dean announcing the split that summer before Tori filed for divorce the following year. When the divorce was eventually settled, court filings revealed there was essentially nothing left to divide beyond shared debt. No spousal support and no significant assets, just outstanding tax bills, medical costs, and loans. Through all of this financial turmoil, one asset has remained consistently valuable and entirely her own: Tori's continuing residual income from Beverly Hills 90210, along with related book deals, podcast work, and her personal media brand. It has functioned as something close to a financial lifeline in years when almost everything else in her life felt unstable. A strange full-circle reminder that the very show once dismissed as nepotism casting became the most reliable source of income she has ever had. There has also been one meaningful shift in the family relationship that started all of this. After roughly 16 years of distance and estrangement, Tori and her mother, Candy, reportedly began reconciling around 2022, rebuilding communication after years apart. Candy has reportedly assured her daughter that she and the grandchildren will be looked after, though no details about any future inheritance or financial support have ever been made public. Candy's own fortune, still estimated at around $600 million, remains largely tied up in trusts and long-term charitable commitments, and whether any of it will eventually make its way to Tori remains an open question that neither side has answered publicly. So, why does this story keep resurfacing online, more than 20 years after Tori Spelling's death? Partly it is the sheer scale of the numbers involved, a fortune measured in the hundreds of millions reduced, for one daughter, to less than a fraction of a percent. Partly it is the uncomfortable timing of that final will, rewritten just weeks before a man's death, at a point when his own medical records already documented cognitive decline. And partly it is simply the human contrast at the center of it all. A woman who spent her childhood inside the largest private home in Los Angeles County, who later found herself photographed outside a budget motel with 5 sick children and nowhere stable to sleep. Whatever judgment people want to make about how Tori Spelling has managed her money in the years since, the inheritance itself remains a genuinely strange case study in estate planning, family loyalty, and the quiet power of a single legal clause. An $800,000 payout might sound like a fortune to most people watching this story unfold, but set against a $600 million empire, and against a childhood spent believing that kind of wealth was simply how life worked, it is easy to understand why so many people still find themselves asking the same question decades later. How exactly did this happen? And why did nobody ever fight it?